Well, welcome everybody. This is ICANA, the Instituto Cultural Argentino Norteamericano in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and we're delighted to have Wayne Escoffery joining us today. Hello, Wayne.
Hello, how are you?
We're good. Where are you?
I'm in my apartment in New York City.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. You know that we're celebrating the end of the festival, the Mingus Festival in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And it was very important for all of us here in Buenos Aires to have you, to have the Institute being part of this, part of the celebration. So tell us a little bit about you, Wayne, please.
Sure. I play the tenor saxophone, of course, and I've been a member of the Mingus Big Band since 2000, so that's about 23 years. I've had the pleasure of playing Mingus's music and exploring the different facets of it with the big band, the orchestra, and the dynasty. We've traveled all over the world, including trips to Buenos Aires. And I also work with my own group, the Wayne Escoffery Quartet, Black Art Jazz Collective, Tom Harrell, and many other great jazz groups.
Lovely. And let me introduce our friend here in Buenos Aires, Argentina, Juan Clas. Juan, bienvenido.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, thanks a lot. Thanks for inviting me here, very humbly, and very grateful also to have the chance to chat with such a great musician. So I've been stalking you since I have known this interview was coming. And it's awesome for me since I am here because I've been in the artistic direction of an ensemble devoted to Mingus's music for about 80 years. So this is why I am here. I am the main arranger and etc. for that group, which is called Mingunos. And we released already 2 albums, which feature basically all music by Mingus with our own arrangements. And actually, we also started in the process of composing our own music, but based on Mingus, some of his elements, some of his style. Nice. So that's what I'm doing currently. Also, currently I'm working more in the classical music world, which is something that is interesting to think about the possibility of bridging some of Mingus's music to also a more classical tradition, which actually kind of happened in some of his compositions. So that's
great to have you here. And you know that we're all doing this work because we honor the work of Charles Mingus, and we want to know more about the musician and the man behind the musician. We're coordinating this at ICANA, el Instituto Cultural Argentino Norteamericano in Buenos Aires, where the American space, where we try to strengthen the ties between Argentina and the United States, and we do it through the teaching of English and also in our cultural programming. We're joined with our partners at the U.S. Embassy in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and it's thanks to them that we made this conversation and this program possible. So I guess all our audience here wants to know more about your work, your experience, and your expertise. So the floor is open. Juan.
Well, so the first thing I wanted to ask you, I was curious about if you can remember which was the first tune you ever heard or played from Mingus.
Sure. Well, I think probably the first song, the first tune that I ever played of Mingus's was probably when I was studying jazz in high school, when I was probably around maybe 16 years old, 15 years old. And I think most students who play Mingus's music start off with nostalgia. Where it's a very singable melody, easy to remember, and it's also simple, And it's a great way to introduce students to the blues. So Nostalgia in Times Square was certainly probably the first tune that I played.
I think I can probably say the same, and it's true. It's probably one of the most easy to recognize Mingus tunes. For me, the one that grabbed my attention the most, although Nostalgia was, of course, one of the first I knew, the first time I heard or read and then played Fables of Faubus, you know.
Of course, I mean, you know, but that's, I think that's starts to get more intricate in some ways and starts to incorporate a lot of the other characteristic elements of Mingus. But when I was young, for sure, that was probably a little bit over my head. So nostalgia was my first one. But of course, I love Fables. I play that quite often.
Do you remember when was your first professional opportunity? I mean, not in Mingus Big Band, but when was the first time you played Mingus music on a stage in front of an audience? Maybe it was in high school.
That's an interesting question. You know, the funny thing is, probably the first time that I played a Mingus composition professionally in public was with the Mingus Big Band. You know, I of course, like I had mentioned, had worked on Mingus's music and used Mingus's music as an educational, and it was used as an educational device to teach me. But I hadn't really performed much of Mingus's music before I joined the Mingus Big Band. And I joined the band in 2000. And the first performance I did with the band was actually 2000 on Thanksgiving. It's a holiday that we celebrate, you know, in the U.S. still. And the big band played at this place called the Time Cafe every Thursday. Mm-hmm. And this Thursday fell on the holiday, Thanksgiving. So a lot of the regular musicians traveled home to be with their families. So Sue Mingus, the widow of Charles Mingus, called me and asked me if I would like to play with the band this Thursday because many of them were out of town and she needed a saxophone player. And I went down, and that was the first time I played with the Mingus Big Band at the Time Cafe in Manhattan. And that's probably really at least the first time that I can recall performing Mingus's music in front of a live audience.
Thanks, Wayne, for sharing how you started with the big band. Please share with us how the big band started. And you mentioned Sue Mingus, Charles' wife.
Well, you know, you'll have to fact check me about the dates, but I believe Charles Mingus died in 1979, and right after his passing, immediately after that, Sue Mingus put together the first, you know, Mingus Dynasty band after Charles, and really from the day after his passing, that was the beginning of her starting this kind of new chapter of performing Charles Mingus's music. And it started with that Dynasty group, which was a smaller sextet, I believe. And the group expanded into, you know, what you know now as the big band, the orchestra, a different version of the Dynasty. So really, as soon as his passing, that was a big part of what Sue Mingus wanted to do. That was a part of her legacy, and that will continue on Charles Mingus's music.
During the festival, especially in the past 6 months or so, we've been working with our students and our community on knowing a bit more about Charles Mingus music. And time again, we could hear and read about the magic of Mingus music. And we would like to know from you what you think, or what's the idea behind the magic of Mingus music. What do you think that people refer to?
You know, I mean, that's obviously subjective, and people hear different things. Even when people talk about my playing or other people's playing, they always point out different things that are very apparent to them, and sometimes it's not even apparent to me at all. So it's definitely something that's very subjective. But that being said, I think, you know, we touched on it earlier, the fact that Mingus's music incorporates elements of the blues. But Mingus was really great at having a balance of many different aspects always present within each song. You know, not in for the most part, one song didn't sound like one thing. You know, it just sounded like Mingus. And the reason why it sounded like Mingus is because they always incorporated different elements of a lot of different things, incorporated elements of classical music, incorporated elements of the blues or gospel music, incorporated elements of bebop, incorporated elements of modern jazz harmony. You know, within one song, you might hear all of those things kind of equally represented within one piece of music. And that's very hard to do. And it's very hard to do without the music sounding forced or insincere or unnatural. And Mingus was able to accomplish that. So I think maybe that's one of the things that is the Mingus magic. You always know it's Mingus's music, and you always hear all of those things within one piece of music.
Yeah, that's totally true, and you never know which turn a Mingus tune will take you to. And I was actually going to ask you, what do you think is the most particular element which differentiates Mingus from other great jazz composers? And I believe, well, we are already talking about that, no?
Sure. Well, I think those, what I just described, is definitely one of those big characteristics. You know, I think also one of the main characteristics is that while in my opinion, you know, jazz music really tells the story of really the you know, the African American and the African struggle in the Americas, you know, and it kind of is a soundtrack to that struggle. So every jazz musician, in my opinion, especially those who were prominent, you know, during the civil rights movement, like, you know, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, like all of those musicians, I think were telling that story through their music. So Mingus isn't different in that regard so much. But I would say that Mingus, in a lot of ways, might have been more overt and more obvious in his protests and his message of social justice within his music. I think probably he had many more compositions than a lot of other musicians did that were focused on messages of social justice and equity and racial issues. And he also incorporated those narratives into the music, right? Even songs like you mentioned, Fables and Fables, that has a lyric that specifically addresses a certain event. You know, Meditations on a Pair of Wire Cutters, specifically addressing a certain event. So a lot of these pieces, that narrative is interwoven in the music. And I don't think that's as apparent with a lot of other musicians as it is with Charles Mingus.
That's totally true. I of course I am aware of all of this because of the titles of the songs, also reading the Mingus book, you know, with all the tunes and the explanation of what's behind all of those. And yeah, I've never stopped to think that, yeah, I mean, of course, Monk's or Ned's music, they express some of these things, but it's maybe not explicit. Maybe in Mingus' case, he's going like straight to the point, which is awesome. Actually, at that time, it was really necessary.
Right.
Yeah, and bueno, some of that justice or seeking for justice, we still need to keep on doing it. So that's,
sure. And I think, yeah, it's important, I think, for people now to remember or to realize that those messages were a big part of the inspiration behind the compositions themselves. So you can't really separate it so much.
Something else we wanted to ask you, Wayne, is about another trait that is attributed to Charles Mingus, and that's his leadership style and how he connected with his band and other musicians. We know that he, at one point, Mingus settled in New York, and he was very much in contact with other musicians, such as Duke Ellington and Miles Davis and others. And they all referred to Mingus as a great leader. What do you think were Was his style like? Why do they talk about Mingus as a real leader?
Well, I mean, first of all, unfortunately, I never had the honor of working with Charles Mingus personally, though I do know some musicians who have, people like Jack Walrath and Earl McIntyre and John Stonefield. And, there's some of those musicians who actually worked with Mingus. So what I know is definitely secondhand through them, and also through, just what Sue Mingus has told me, and in some ways through her style. And first, you should realize that not all great musicians are great leaders. Just like
Exactly.
not all great musicians are even great educators.
Mhm.
There are some amazing musicians who need guidance, creative guidance. That's why we have music producers and things of that, and conductors and things of that nature. And Mingus obviously kind of had an innate talent for leading a group. He obviously had broad ideas of how he wanted to tell a story, how he wanted to, have an arc from beginning to end of a piece or of a large work. Those are things that don't come natural to everyone. Also, he, for better or for worse, he had the ability socially to deal with a lot of different kind of people. Now, that might seem odd that I'm saying that, because Mingus is known for having a lot of confrontations with musicians and being, sometimes difficult to interact with socially. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of that in the press, and there's a lot of that that's been written about. And I won't necessarily dispute that entirely, but I will say, well, if that's the case, how did he have all of these bands? How did he have all of these great musicians committed to him, like Danny Richmond, all of these, John Hicks and all these amazing musicians? How was he able to keep these bands for so long? Obviously, they loved and respected Charles Mingus's artistic integrity. Obviously, they respected his musical abilities and his craft. And obviously, they trusted him, because you can't be a great leader unless your musicians trust you musically and artistically. So, and you can't be a great leader unless you're able to relay to other people, a variety of people, what you're trying to get. And despite what anyone has ever said about Mingus, but despite what anything is written about Mingus, there's a large body of work by a huge amount of his different ensembles that is entirely a huge success. So obviously, he knew how to communicate and get what he wanted from the musicians. And I think those are the most important things: to have a big vision, to have a vision that other musicians respect and appreciate, to have music that other musicians who are great musicians respect, which is a huge compliment, that other musicians at a high level, people like Eric Dolphy, and all these amazing musicians respected Mingus' artistic, creation, and then that you can actually communicate what you want. So he obviously had all of those things.
Thanks for sharing, Wayne. And I think, Juan, you have another question for Wayne.
Yeah, so I was wondering, actually looking also at the picture you have in the background, how was your experience with Epitaph, this kind of very big work from Mingus? I understand you had the chance to play it, but also to conduct it in another occasion. So can you tell us about that?
Sure. Well, my first experience with Epitaph was under the guidance of Gunther Schuller. So I think in around 2006, we did a tour, and I played Epitaph several times as the first tenor under Gunther Schuller, and then we did excerpts of it in a variety of different places over the years. So I played Epitaph maybe half a dozen to 10 times as a musician, and then this was the first presentation of it where I conducted, and we did that at Yale University just 2 months ago. And it was an amazing experience, and a completely different experience conducting the piece than performing the piece. As a musician, first of all, Epitaph is an amazing epic work. It's really a masterpiece, and it's very, very dense. It's written for 31 plus musicians. So it's a very dense piece of music. And when you're in that ensemble playing, it's really hard to get the big picture of what's happening. Every now and then you might understand the big picture, but really you're focusing on your part, the intricacies of the music, the sensitivities, you're listening to certain people in the band to get certain cues into certain areas, but it's very hard to listen to the big picture. As a conductor, as the role as a conductor, I really studied the piece in a different way than I'd ever studied it before. I studied it for months and months, very thoroughly. Both listening and both, going through the score, measure by measure. So I was able to get a new understanding of what I think Mingus was going for with each movement. And really, there were many, many eye-opening moments and really epiphanies that I had when studying this music. And it just made me appreciate it even more and kind of understand it even more. And ironically, in some ways, it made it a little bit simpler in some ways, because when you step back to really see what the concept was that Mingus, or at least my perception of what Mingus was going for, you start to say, oh, I see, I get it. It's not as necessarily even as complicated as we think. It's an arc and it goes like this and it goes here. You understand it completely differently. So I'm really grateful that I had the opportunity to conduct the piece. And it's really life-changing, really, from a musical standpoint and from an educational standpoint. Really, really great that I had that opportunity.
Well, that's amazing. Bueno, we hope now that ICANA will get you over here and we can do our version in Argentina.
Sure.
And in the meantime, there are also a lot of other very interesting of these kind of epic tunes, which are amazing and very interesting to try to perform, such as, the shoes of the fisherman's wife, that one?
Sure, of course. That's slippers,
yeah. But how is your experience actually working with Gunther Schuller, which is like the man himself, who worked with Mingus, and I understand he actually wrote the arrangements. I mean, the music you're actually reading.
Sure. Well, he was a big part. Really the music was already written and it was pieced together by Gunther Schuller and Andrew Homsey. And then of course there were some parts where I'm sure Gunther, had made his input, where he made some, artistic choices. Working with Gunther was great. Gunther hears everything. He's really a master musician. He's a master conductor. And it was challenging at times too, because Gunther's very particular. And sometimes it would take us all day to get through, one movement. And in my directing and conducting at Epitaph, one of the main things I wanted to do was make sure that the musicians got to play through everything a few times, which unfortunately we didn't really get to do that much with Gunther in preparation, because he was so particular and so adamant about getting certain aspects right, but sometimes we didn't have time to go through everything. But it was really a pleasure to play it under his guidance, because he worked with Mingus, and he really was the one who coined that term third string music because of Epitaph and some of the things that Mingus was dealing with.
Okay, Wayne, this has been a great opportunity for all of us to know a bit more about Mingus and his work and his legacy, undoubtedly. And but before we conclude, we wanted to ask you if there's any other information that you would like to share with us, with our audience here today, about his work, his legacy.
Not much. I think, one of the great and unique things about Mingus and his music too is that I don't think he wanted it to be played the same all the time. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's great that we're in this new chapter, entering the second centennial of Mingus, where in the younger generation, those students that are in high school, maybe just learning about the music, or in college, are getting to experience Mingus's music, reinterpret it, and kind of use Mingus's music, as I did, as we mentioned, as a young age, of really using the music to understand the vocabulary of jazz, to understand the technique of their instrument, to understand the harmonies. It's a great tool for education, for music education, and just realize that these pieces, not just Mingus's music, but in particular Mingus, because we're speaking about that, these pieces are kind of, in some ways, a starting point. once you've mastered how to play the music, how Mingus did, the whole idea is to take those devices in the music as a springboard to see what else we can come up with. And that's what Mingus really was trying to do when he asked musicians to join his band. So that's what we need to try to keep on doing.
Thanks so much, Wayne. We know that in just a few hours you are heading for Europe to play Mingus music. So we wish you the best there, and I want to thank Juan Glass for joining us today.
Thank you.
And well, we hope to see you in Buenos Aires and go see your music and your performance, or else we go to New York and visit with the Mingus Band. Thanks so much, Wayne Escoffery. Thanks for joining us. This is ICANA in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Thank you.
My pleasure. Ciao.